Hello, everyone, and welcome to our municipality. We are a student-run podcast exploring the wonders of local government, politics, and advocacy. And I'm Adrian, and today I'm here with Kylie to be interviewing Gretchen, Ranka, and Janet Kinney about their lives as public servants and local agents for change. Gretchen, Ranka, and Janet Kinney are feminists, librarians, and social activists. Gretchen earned her BA at St. Catherine's College. Janet's BA is from McAllister College, and both hold MA and library science degrees from the University of Minnesota. I first met Gretchen when I was working as an organizer with the Minnesota Democratic Farmer Labor Party, also known as the DFL. And Gretchen was one of my best volunteers, and she made calls with us every week to get out the vote in Minnesota. She recently introduced me to Jan, one of her longtime friends and fellow activists. And I'm so grateful to have them here joining us today. So I'll get it started off by just asking how you two first met.
Well, thank you for inviting us to be on. It's great to be able to share some memories. We both were active as college students in the Minnesota Young DFL. It was in the days before you couldn't vote until you were 18 years old. So the senior party supported Young Democrats, and we had exciting times at conventions. We rallied, we spoke, we discussed policy at great levels, and found ourselves as kindred spirits among the Minnesota college students. How do you remember that, Jan?
I mostly remember you at the conferences and the conventions. Gretchen was always the most organized and the most active and wonderfully vocal, and would rally us around issues and concepts and concerns that we had. So it was very fun. I went to a college near hers, but they were quite different colleges. So it was fun to compare and contrast how we were being received and how our friends at the colleges were. So it was good times.
It was interesting too, because it was a day of beginning political activism for students. And we had the opportunity to rub elbows with Minnesota's young Attorney General, Walter Mondale. Hubert Humphrey came to those conventions. He loved to hear the students. He liked to ask questions. He liked to hear what we were thinking about. Gene McCarthy was our senator. So, you know, those legendary figures in the history of Minnesota Democratic politics were part of our acculturation, I think, into politics.
They definitely had a big impact on how my views were developed during that time. They were very powerful speakers, and yet they were very accessible. I mean, you'd walk up to Hubert Humphrey as if he were your uncle, and it was pretty amazing that. And when you think back on the opportunities that we had to learn about the history of the Farmer Labor Party in Minnesota and to become active as a student, when that was pretty unusual.
And I think they looked at us as cheap labor too. You know,
absolutely.
Lots of door knocking, lots of volunteering, lots of envelope stuffing, and
and how
spending
about
time.
The mimeograph? Remember the mimeograph?
Grinding away. So, but we made long time connections, and I was looking through some of the archives, which I'm going to pitch one of these days. But a lot of Minnesota legislators who did great things in Minnesota politics started out in the Young Democrats, and I think that's probably exactly I expect to be voting for Adrian someday, and probably you too, Kylie.
Amen. You know, probably Kylie too.
you just never, once you get bitten by that bug, it's very difficult to give it up, and I think that's why so many of us reactivated this campaign season.
Right. Okay. Gotcha. So keeping kind of in that time back then when you were in college and just starting to get your feet wet, what issues were really important to students back then? And do you think that those were like the right issues to be focusing on at the time?
Gretchen, I think I'm going to take that one first.
Please.
At our campus in McAllister, we started out at very localized issues. I mean, very localized campus. When we first went, the women's students were treated very differently than the men's students. We had different services. We had access to different resources. We had to be back in our dorm by 7 p.m. So we couldn't even get to the library. So it was really a different world than I still can't believe it was true. So for the first couple of years, we really were organizing around issues to eliminate those barriers and have equality and access to everything on campus. it took us all 4 years to really begin to make that process happen. So we're, especially the first couple of years, very, very locally focused. After that, the civil rights movement was just beginning to come to our awareness. And so we became a little more broadly focused on civil rights. And just near the very end of my college undergraduate work, we started to be aware of the issues going on in Asia. How about you, Gretchen?
Well, I think, St. Catherine's a Catholic girls' school. Back in those days, we had even more repressive rules. No jeans, no pants on campus. Had to get permission to go off campus. Back in the dorms by 10 o'clock on Friday nights, I think later on it moved up to midnight. I mean, you don't want to hear those dreadful stories. But it was a growing concern, like Jan, as we started to meet college students from the university, where there was a much more, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the outspoken people, Vance Opperman, who later went on to be active in the McCarthy campaign and is a longtime DFL supporter. The issues that were raised and the rhetoric, I mean, pages of speeches. I mean, students weren't, I suppose we used paper rather than tweeting and TikToking and Instagram because that's what we had. But long position papers on Southeast Asia, Latin America. I found an interesting, very pompous article about ethics in government. So it's interesting, some of the issues that you students are worried about today, and of course we as now older citizens are still thinking about. They've been roiling around in the country ever since then. Health, education, and welfare, national defense. I mean, the issues don't seem to change. And as during our prep time, I think we laughed about our generation thought we were going to solve the problems, and now we've landed it right onto you 2 generations down the road.
And Kylie, I'd like to address your question about do we think we had the priorities right? I would have to say some, but not all. And particularly what I've been thinking about lately is when we were at McAllister's and she was at St. Kate's, a neighborhood within 2 miles of our campus was being absolutely destroyed. And what I'm talking about is the Rondo neighborhood in St. Paul was a very active African-American community, highly successful businesses, education. It was really a wonderful neighborhood. But the powers that be were putting the freeway that connected downtown Minneapolis to downtown St. Paul right through the heart of that community. And it really, in effect, destroyed that economic vitality and social vitality for that community. I was clueless. I had no idea. So while we were learning about Selma and beginning to be involved in those kinds of civil rights, we were totally oblivious to what was going on in our local community. And I just think if I'd had any clue, I think we were more focused on the state and the national level and I didn't understand the significance of local involvement.
Well, I think those issues, Jan and I talked a little bit about this. It was sort of a bureaucratic thing. Tax money was going into that freeway system, and it wasn't perceived in the broader community as certainly racist and destructive and tearing the fabric of the community apart. It was the brave new world of connecting the Twin Cities. And we marched for voters' rights from the college campuses to the state capitol, and we would have gone right, blocks from Rondo, right on the edge of Rondo without a thought. And that is shameful and unfortunate. Again, listening to some of your other podcaster speakers refer a lot to white privilege, and I think that was not a term in our day. We thought we were idealistic. We thought we were doing the right
inclusive
thing. A naivete and an ignorance. There were most of the students of color at St. Catherine's when I was there were students from Central American countries or Africa. They were wealthy young women who came to study in the United States. And so there was very little exchange of we were all white girls, many from small towns, rural areas. And, then there were the city girls. But that was basically the diversity, which is pretty sad in retrospect. And we're still getting over that, I think. You have to. I'm so proud now of my alma mater because they have many, many students of color now. They have great scholarships. It's wonderful to be on campus and see the young women in their hijabs and taking an active role in student government and all the other students that are bringing a vibrant feel to the contemporary University of St. Catherine.
That is so awesome. I definitely have felt kind of like that, at least about like my high school. I went to like a primarily white high school in Edina, Minnesota. Even though it was like a public school, it was just, the nature of Edina, as you two know, is just like very predominantly white city and pretty wealthy. And so I definitely felt that even like now that in like a community like that, you're kind of insulated, kind of like as like a white person, you just kind of be blinded by your privilege in that environment. And I obviously like going to university and through a bunch of my involvement have tried to and still try to break that. But yeah, it's really interesting. I kind of want to ask a little bit more about your time in university and the interactions that you had with administration and when y'all were like working on or talking about like changing those like rights for women at your universities. What were your interactions with the university administrators like? I guess we have like at times strained relationships with university administrators when we try to push for change. So I'm just interested to hear what that was like for y'all.
Well, I would sum it up with one word: challenging. At Macalester, I think pretty much they just thought we were trouble. We weren't very much of a force yet, and student power wasn't very strong yet. So they were just kind of, I always felt like I was being patted on my head, when we try to organize things. But Macalester did have a very international focus during those times. So we would have big rallies and things like that on campus, but it was always under the tutelage of the professorate, and so we never got very far. But I don't think we were particularly what they wanted us to be. And then at the graduate level, our library school was actually the first graduate program that closed down during the U of M Vietnam War protest. And so I think the library school, because we emphasized intellectual freedom and the ability for individuals to speak, they kind of let us have forums and things like that. But we were definitely it was discussed that we were not being professional, which was a very high value in graduate school at that time. Thinking back, I don't think the larger university administration had a clue that the library school was doing anything because the whole campus was under such siege. This is the time when there were helicopters circulating the campus at all times, and there were barriers and all kinds of activities were going on. So in the small school of the library school, I think we were considered pretty radical and not too pleasant. But at the big campus, I don't think they really noticed. What do you think, Gretchen?
Well, I agree with that. I think we didn't go back. We didn't start grad school right after we got out of college. And we might as well say the date, Jan 1966 was the year we graduated from college. So I didn't start at the U until 1970. And so we'd had a couple of years as professionals working. I worked for the Queensboro Public Library in New York. And society was becoming much more radicalized around the Vietnam War at that time. And so, of course, New York was a hotbed of protests, all the time. You could march every weekend. And a mutual friend of Jan and mine, who also grew up in the Minnesota YDFL, Larry Fredrickson, insisted that when we met to march, we wore heels, nylons, and white gloves because we had to show. That's kind of sick, isn't it? But it was also very uncomfortable walking. But the whole idea was to show that it wasn't just radicals and hippies, and the student nonviolent coordinating committees that were running this.
Even though we belonged to those.
Yes, we did.
And one of our themes was "Be Clean for Jean." It was Eugene McCarthy. So we'd wear our, very prim and proper professional clothes in the marches in New York City.
But back to being a college student in St. Paul during those years, of course, the rules in a Catholic girls' school were strict. I remember once, as I was president of the YDFL club on campus, and we invited Joan Mondale, Walter Mondale's wife, to speak to one of our meetings. And of course, she was a young mother at the time, and this was during his term as Minnesota Attorney General. And Joan Mondale, you may recall, was particularly interested in art. She had a fine arts degree, and she was a wonderful Renaissance sort of woman. And we had a great meeting, and we did, of course, serve coffee, and we were hospitable. And I got a note in my mailbox from the Dean of Students the next day, and it was typed and signed, "See me in my office the next time you invite someone of the stature of Mrs. Mondale to speak to your club. You must let the administration know." So, I mean, there was a real parental attitude. And one of the regrets of my life, I thought I was so bold and noble, and St. Thomas, the boys' college down the street, was sponsoring a bus to go down to do voter registration in the summer of, it must have been the summer of '64, probably, Jan. And it was, pay $10 and ride on the bus and go down for a weekend or something. These were not long-term, at least for us. And so we marched in to the administration and said, we want to go on that bus with the St. Thomas students, and we need Friday and Monday off. Well, the Dean of Students looked at us and smiled, and she said, "Well, you will not have my permission." And you couldn't go anyplace without permission. And we weren't as brave as the McAllister students, because we didn't argue about that. Now, a year later, 2 years later, yes, I think the students would have come. It was the beginning of tremendous changes on campuses then, where we grew up listening. Some of us grew up, where you were obedient, and some people got out of that a little earlier than the rest of us.
That's very interesting, and it was definitely a time of a lot of change from what you're saying. So kind of the next step forward where we wanted to go in this podcast today was talking about your interactions, not only within the universities, but within local government and local institutions outside of the university. So when did those interactions or paths start to cross with local government and other institutions in the community?
Well, I think both of us worked for public libraries, and public libraries are, of course, tax-supported institutions, so we are embedded in local communities. So I think, based on experience, both in our college years, where we were concerned about the war and broader, becoming more interested in global issues, and our experience in New York City, when we came back to Minnesota, it was to revolutionize the library world, and it was the idea of we fought against the stereotype of the librarian image, and the idea was librarians as change agents. And so I think that's when Jan and I and several colleagues who are still good friends first really coalesced together in the Minnesota Library Association, a group, the Social Responsibilities Roundtable. And that was where we realized the power of librarians at the local level to work with the changing demographics. To the library really has never been an elite institution, but for people whose literacy level is not low, there is a stereotype. And I think Jan, our fearless leader, launched an amazing project with the women's prison in Shakopee that just gave us a goal in our life. So
at the time, there was no library service to the prison institutions in Minnesota. And we were, being feminists, we were particularly involved with the one in Shakopee. And it was it was a huge experience for, maybe we go back to the white privilege concept of who we met and worked with, inmates and staff at the Shakopee prison. At one point, we had collected like 25,000 books, which was just a little bit more than could fit in their library. But it was a great organizing experience. And that would, when would that have been? 1972 or so, I would guess. But it did bring us in contact with the the justice system, which of course continues to be a major concern for all of us. I think the part about that I found kind of interesting, I kind of felt like there were two parts to my life, because I would be active in social justice groups, but when I was more of an administrator in the library's business. And so you have a certain role when you're that. As a librarian, I wanted to make sure the community saw us as an information resource and unbiased, open to all kind of position. So especially in my later years, it became a little more complex between how you could advocate in the public and yet maintain that professional information system role. And I'd come into the libraries mostly through computers. And so it was a real effort to try to help people understand that the library was the information highway, as we loved to call it at the time. And there were lots of conflicts with that, because a lot of people, of course, wanted to keep their library for their purpose and their needs. So I thought that I think we did some good work, Gretchen, on helping communities in the Twin Cities area move through that time frame from being only books and only pretty, shush kind of libraries to an active community involvement. And Gretchen did amazing work with the young people. She was former president of the Library Association for young people. And she's really been a national leader in that, and trying to make sure that we work with literacy. When we first started with librarianship, children didn't come to the library until they were 3 and potty trained. But we realized that those first 3 years are the critical years in learning literacy, and Gretchen was one of the national leaders in that.
Well, only because of administrators like Jan who supported it. We who go out into the trenches have to get away from the desk. But it was an exciting, changing time as the technology came in to make some of the routine library work easier. But we had a number of colleagues who were active at the national level, both Robert Rolfe, the director of Hennepin County Library, who promoted the use of audiovisual materials and things that now seem, you couldn't imagine, not having those sorts of things in libraries. And Sanford Berman, anybody who is at the University of Madison and its library school is going to bow their head when they hear Sanford Berman's name. But the whole idea of subject headings, the Library of Congress subject headings, incandescent light instead of light bulb. I mean, just ridiculous things. And the whole idea was to make the library a place that would be accessible to people, accessible. So the whole idea of literacy, instead of wallowing around with tiny children and loving children and doing cute things with puppets and stuff, the idea became parents and caregivers are the people who need to hear the literacy message, that a librarian working with a child in one story time a week is not going to prepare that child for school. And so that was a leap forward in looking at how staff who work with children in public libraries went about their day's work. And that was a revolutionary change. And Jan was in the administration of Brooklyn Public Library and also Multnomah County Public Library. And those systems were radicalizing their youth services programs at that time too.
I'd just like to talk about BPL for a minute. The Brooklyn Public Library had 60 libraries serving the borough of Brooklyn, and I was fortunate to be there right after 9/11, which was just a tremendously challenging and difficult time for the city of New York. And we served, we tried to collect in over 90 languages, and we tried to serve communities of all types with what seemed at the time a large budget, but it was really quite limited in trying to bring equality. We did find we had some lovely libraries in some of the perfect white communities, but we had disgraceful libraries in some of the others. And so working on those issues, right, and when awareness was really with us about what had happened in 9/11 and what our communities were, how fast they wof changing. So that was a real experience where we could bring kind of our radical advocacy into the public sphere and kind of make it, I think we tried to make a difference.
Well, and one of the things too, talking about local government, for instance, the library system where I worked, Hennepin County, the governing body is the County Board of Commissioners. And there is a thin line as you move into the world of the bureaucracy while you're working, of you as an employee or a staff person, developing relations with whoever is in charge, the CEO or whatever. But we found in youth services, by developing a slick, short message about the importance of children's literacy development, that the public library is part of the community infrastructure that prepares children to start school ready to learn to read. And working with, we did work with the University of Minnesota. They were doing some very interesting research there about children's language development and how the language of their heart, their first language, if they were Spanish speaking, the parents needed to have the confidence to read and sing and talk to their children in that language, the language of their heart, so that the children developed the vocabulary. So when they started school and started to learn English, it would be much easier for them. And that was a message that not everyone wanted to hear, but it resonated with public officials because it took the library, it helped the library become part of that collaborative effort for children to succeed in school, working with children in corrections, helping, we did libraries all across the country were doing this, it wasn't just us, but the whole idea of giving children a voice. So doing some grant writing to fund literary magazines, so children in Hennepin County Corrections could write and publish a poetry magazine or participate in some drama. The whole idea that the library is integral. It's not separate for those elite children who are already literate when they start school. And I think this mission is continued. We would hope, Jan, we hope.
We would hope.
I don't know, one person that you may want to talk to, Marcela Sanchez is the coordinator of youth services for the Madison Public Library. And Marcela started as a young outreach. Well, we hired her with a grant to do programming in Spanish for Latino families in Richfield, Minnesota. And we nurtured her along, and no, not, I've got to go back. It's not Marcella. Marcella did that work, but we'll cut this. I'll find out that you want to talk to the user. Tammy Pineda is the youth service coordinator in Madison, and she started as an outreach worker, not a librarian, but she was one of the first non-librarians who worked for Hennepin County, and her role was to go out into the community, to talk to the Latino families, to talk to teachers in the school, and bring Latino families into the public library, and like Jan's work in Brooklyn, to see that the collection reflected materials in Spanish and other languages. And so ultimately, we were able to bring on Hmong and Somali staff to do that kind of work too. But Tammy was our star because she went on to get a master's in library science from the University of Madison, or University of Wisconsin at Madison. So one of your colleagues there.
So cool.
You better let them ask another question.
Yeah, Kyle, I'm sorry about that.
All good. I'll have to
I forgot about her. How could I?
That is so cool. My mom works in Richfield Public Schools, which I might have told Gretchen before, but I've done a little bit of, I've taken Spanish all through school, so I've done a little bit of translating work for her in that, and it's just really interesting and like I just never really thought about that in like the library system, but that's so cool that y'all were doing that work because it's so important. And my mom works in early childhood there, so they're all like literacy.
Well, and the Bloomington and Richfield early childhood education were combined until I think last year or the year before. So we may have come across each other at one point. We had at one point a children's readmobile that visited early childhood programs and programs for pregnant and parenting teens in the South Metro area. There were collaboratives, very, very vibrant collaboratives several decades ago.
Okay.
That's so cool. Well, thank you both for sharing all that stuff. That is super interesting. I think just for some of us and for our listeners, I'm sure, who are probably at some, like, you know, are going to pursue a variety of career paths and not like directly be in politics, it's super interesting to hear about different ways that you can make an impact like that through other careers. And I think I was in a webinar earlier today actually talking about like post-campaign work and just how you can live your values in whatever career you're in, and trying to like expand you know, access and equity wherever you are. So that's like super cool to hear that.
Great.
I think next question I want to ask about, let's see. I guess if we want to talk more about like talk about more about how y'all made a difference in stuff you're doing as librarians. I know that Gretchen had mentioned before, like the committee that y'all formed of like librarians. I forget the name of it, but you guys are working for like social change in the libraries. If you want to talk more about that, that'd be super interesting. I guess kind of just talk about how, and also as Jan was mentioning, how in kind of a public facing role that's sometimes supposed to be like neutral, how you can make change and not appear like, you know, biased or whatever. And obviously like we are all biased, but more about that as well.
Oh, that's right up your alley, Jan. You can take that one.
Well, it was, I've had some interesting experiences with that, and I still struggle with it because that concept of professionalism and advocacy, I think, can be perceived in almost threatening ways at times. And to be effective in bringing about change, you know, you kind of have to play both sides. And I'm not sure how relevant this is, but as an administrator and being active in the community, I was often asked to be like on the Chamber of Commerce or join the Rotary or organizations that, frankly, I would probably not have chosen to be a member of on my own. But because I did have that position in the community, I was able to take the story of the library to parts of the community I probably would not have talked to. And it was always interesting to find how many comrades you had, how many people belonged to those organizations who really wanted to support change in their community and who really wanted to bring social justice to a new level. So, but I do still struggle with it, and I would love to hear what, you know, as you guys face this issue too, how do we bring our message to a variety of audiences in a way that they can actually hear it? And are we actually listening to their needs, which I think is extremely difficult. I know it's difficult for me. I want to tell them my answer, right? But that listening aspect and being able to have empathy and understanding of other people's positions, I think that's a real important part that maybe I missed in my early years of being an activist. So one of the things I'd love to know is your advice to us. How do we, as you know, seniors, and in the time of COVID, you know, I'm not doing a lot of the stuff that I would have normally done. There have been protests in Minneapolis that I have not gone to. I mean, I can hardly believe it. But I've got to find new ways to participate, and I think we're looking to people like you to help us identify how we can use the old skills that we have, but bring them to this new environment under your leadership. You have any comments on that?
I think I also have felt, kind of blocked from direct participation in a way because of COVID. Like I was in Minneapolis for the whole summer and only went to like one in-person demonstration or following the murder of George Floyd and felt bad that I couldn't be more of a part of that movement. But I was like in at least for me, like my way of connecting to that was doing a lot of online stuff. So I helped organize a fundraiser with my university as like a collaboration between our student government and our Black Student Union. And so we basically raised money to benefit Black student organizations. And so I forget how much money we raised, probably like $50,000.
Yay.
And so that was really cool. I mean, I was kind of doing that through social media and then just like through relational organizing with people that I know to kind of build that connection. And I think it had it not been for kind of a tumultuous student government transition, it would have probably been a continued collaboration that would have been really great. But I think just, I mean, because everything was online and because of COVID, it was just kind of hard to continue that work. But yeah, I think like finding ways that you can connect, like going to, there's all kinds of like Zoom meetings that y'all I'm sure know about, like online or clubs and, you know, community organizations that are doing education work, but also advocacy. So I think like I go to my university's ACLU Student Alliance meetings every week. We talk about like either we usually do like a national, state, and local campaign. So I think our national campaign is like supporting Indigenous sovereignty. So we kind of do awareness about different Indigenous groups that are like working for their sovereignty around the country and like kind of try to support their petitions and that sort of stuff. And then we do like campaigns like that at different levels, but we like kind of educate ourselves around different issues in that. And then I also go to city meetings for the city of Madison every now and then. So that's something I think has actually been really beneficial about COVID is that all of the city committee meetings are online now. And so like I went to like one city committee meeting before COVID, and now it's just like so easy because you can just like, you know, pull it up on your laptop or whatever. At least for me, that is easy. And it's also like, in some ways, you know, less accessible because not everybody has stable internet access or, you know, that sort of technology. But for me, it's really easy to go to the city meetings and speak in public comment about things like the police budget or like developments, like apartment buildings and that sort of stuff that I want to share my opinion on at the city level. So I guess that's kind of like what I've been doing. And I would like really recommend people like our listeners and y'all, if you aren't get involved with like the city committee stuff, I think like, I don't know exactly how the city of Minneapolis or like Bloomington does their committees online, but I'm sure that they do the committee hearings or whatever. So yeah, those are kind of fun to get involved with.
Yeah, I think this is critically important. It's for me, from the perspective that I have, if I'm not there, it doesn't seem as like I'm being as effective. And yet to recognize that now the format is to do those public comments, you know, not just listen to the city council meeting, but actually take that effort to share your opinion and to try to then talk to your friends and neighbors. I think it's for some of us who grew up in, if you're not on the street, you know, you're not doing your work, this is a whole new world. And I think COVID has forced us to actually grapple with that, where we might have kept the old world kind of trying to go for a while. I think I'm really impressed with the way that you guys are focused on the local government. I think that's really a big mistake that I didn't spend enough time outside of my profession trying to figure out how to influence like the police departments. And, you know, it was just kind of assumed that they were there and that was going to be it. And now I see your generation really grappling with the local. And that's where our lives are really spent, you know, and I'm very impressed with the fact that you're doing this municipality. I think that focus is very, very important.
I think that the other work I did this fall was some volunteering with the Bloomington Ranked Choice Voting Initiative. And that was, you know, the study sessions that were held virtually and, you know, waiting in a queue to make a comment in a public meeting. It is, especially, you know, for people who are having mobility issues as for whatever reason, or maybe as they age, and also for people who no longer enjoy driving at night or during the bad weather, it's a wonderful way to participate. Unfortunately, we don't always have the tech support that Adrian and your colleagues were able to give us. But it's getting easier. I think everybody through their families. So that is actually something. I know the Minnesota Library Association, which continues to love, it's a lobbying force at the Minnesota legislature, and one of their initiatives year after year after year is expanding broadband. And I would think that, Minnesota Library Association and a few other organizations were voices crying in the wilderness until, very, very recently. And so now this is how people, I think probably more parents will be getting involved too, because this is how do you support your child distant learning? All politics is local. Who said that? Some important person said all politics is local. And in whatever organization you're working in too, the careers you're choosing, you as a labor lawyer, Kylie, and Adrian with your interest, your broad interest in politics and government. There are worse things than becoming a government bureaucrat, no matter what the current administration seems to say about it, because they do keep the wheels grinding. And if you have people who have the activist spirit and the social justice and they need to be embedded in our local government too. People with that kind of idealism and the willingness to promote those issues to the public.
Definitely. And that actually takes us kind of to the final place that we were hoping to go in the interview or the little episode today, which was we're kind of going to do a little bit of a roundtable in terms of advice or thoughts on how to do important advocacy work when we're not maybe in those specific local government or specific bureaucracy, quote unquote, positions. So kind of wrapping up and zooming out a little bit, what were the best strategies that you either did in the past or would have wished that you did in the past to kind of advance the work of advocacy into whatever sphere that you found yourself in?
Wow.
That's a hard question. I will say just one thing, because I have always been interested in political advocacy and, democratic, we used to use the word proud to be a hack, but to convince the other youth services librarians and other librarians with whom I worked over a career both in Queensboro, not so much then, but we'll just say here in Minnesota, that librarians need to be political. We're a political institution, we're a tax-funded institution. And yes, the children's librarian needs to be as comfortable speaking to county commissioners in an adult professional manner as he or she is doing a story time with a group of preschoolers. You have to, politics is, and to be aware of those city issues, because every single thing, again, when we're tax funded, there is a pot that is divided among organizations, and it's a responsibility of a citizen, but also of a professional, to inform your local elected officials, your state and your national, on how you would like to see them vote. For instance, the American Library Association is a tremendous advocacy group for librarians across the country. They've been advocating for broadband, e-rates. How do you get those e-books if somebody isn't telling Congress, yes, support this, support. So you start at the local level by making a call. And it's interesting to me how people with great educations and vibrant, interesting people are afraid to pick up the phone and call a city councilman. And it's just weird. And I don't know if you follow Next Door Neighbor or whatever that list is. Communities have these lists for where people can post serious things. Bloomington, right? This is, you're going to edit this out, but Bloomington is hysterical because some wild turkey that was attacking pedestrians and bikers and walking across the street, the DNR disposed of it today. And there were 18 people saying, "Rest in peace, Penny, we'll miss you." And yeah, I mean, it's so pathetic, but then they'll say, "So, you know, what's going on? Why are all these construction projects going on? Nobody's going to use that bridge by Normandale College." And, you know, they don't understand. You can call your council person. You can express your opinion in a reasonable manner. You can follow those issues. People they don't know. How do I call? Somebody a while ago posted, "How do I get in touch with the mayor?" Well, I thought, well, you know, Google, Google. But there seems to be a lack of civic awareness in an era where we have so many communication formats. You know, I'm kind of frothing at the mouth on this. Jan, can you pick that up?
Actually, I find it a very challenging question. I think you got me off on so many tangents on your conversation there. Kylie, would you mind kind of reframing your question? Sorry, maybe you get into this, I think, but.
Sure, definitely. I guess just to wrap up, I was hoping to touch on pieces of advice or things that you wish you could have done maybe in the past for finding ways to expand the work of advocacy, no matter what role you're in, whether in government or outside.
I wish I had better answers. I think we would not be in the position we're in today if more of us had answers to those questions. One of the things that I've also been thinking about a lot during this COVID time and trying to figure out what had happened to our state of Minnesota and the country with the urban-rural divide. I wish I'd been paying a lot more attention to the needs and concerns of a much broader range. I think, you know, we talk about diversity, we sometimes forget some of the divisions that we have closer to home, very close to home. And we've been, as Gretchen said, we've been advocating for broadband coverage in the state of Minnesota for years, but we didn't make it happen. And that allowed that divide, I think, to continue to fester. I mean, you can't expect people to think of equality if they can't get broadband and other critical services delivered to their local area. And how we ever let that kind of divide get so strong, and it's across the country. When you look at the voting patterns, it's just astounding. In all 50 states, we have the urban-rural divide. And I think if I could go back and try to figure out how to change my advocacy, it would be a lot around those kinds of issues. We thought we were seeing the big picture. I'm not sure we did. So I'm looking forward to you guys figuring this out, and then send me an email, okay? With the answer of how to provide that kind of advocacy that will really bring us to the point where, you know, all people really are equal, and we're a long way from that.
Right. And I think I picked up something in both of what you said, Gretchen and Janet, which was kind of the need for very broad coalition building and taking into account perspectives that aren't even maybe at the center of the issue, but those people are still tangentially related, or they can help you solve the issue if we would tip our hats to them, kind of. And it also, it speaks to some of my personal work at Cornell, because I'm actually going to be writing a paper about the urban-rural divide in Minnesota. So
really,
yes, I was pleasantly surprised when you both took it in that direction. But I think for the purposes of today, I definitely wanted to make this last question like a roundtable, and I was planning on saying something very similar to what you both already shared, which was, like I said earlier, this need for broad coalition building, and maybe those people who live in rural places could be our allies or could support us if we understood these base needs that they have. Or I'm sure there's a million other lines we could draw it on besides urban-rural that maybe aren't fully fleshed out. I guess. Wow, it feels like we've opened a whole can of worms right at the end of the episode here. But
well,
I guess
the one thing I want to bring too, Jan mentioned it, and I think both Adrian and you, Kylie, listening. I wish I had been a better listener. I always had an opinion and often didn't listen enough to others. And I think especially, again, that it's exactly what we're talking about if we're not listening to the other people. It's a curious thing that's happening in the Minnesota legislature. 2 longtime DFLers from northern Minnesota have just become independent. So, and I grew up in a small town in Iowa, and I have cousins all, in Iowa, and we don't talk politics. So,
Interesting. Adrian, do you have things to join in on the round table?
Well, a bit. I think I also have been feeling that even with the DFL, that we've kind of just like left behind Greater Minnesota to a degree, maybe the Democratic Party. And a bunch of my fellow organizers from the DFL were talking after the election, kind of just analyzing how the state legislature turned out and just seeing that we really need to do more work with making our policies and priorities work for Greater Minnesota. Like we need to, obviously broadband, but like all of the like farmer and labor advocacy that we do as the Democratic Party as well is like really relevant to northern Minnesota and across the state. And so I think that it's just about like, to some degree, we were talking about wanting to make our messaging work more for that. And so I think so much of the messaging, me, it's just because like I live in urban areas, is that like I feel like so much of the messaging is just for those issues. But like talking about affordable housing and stuff, but affordable housing is still an important issue across the state. It's just a different issue, or I guess.
And childcare across the state in some communities, childcare is a huge issue for working women. And so then with the economic situation, the issues that impact families are the same, and there may be more resources at the level. And I'm thinking too of work partnering with many of the tribal communities too. Al Franken last year did that massive fundraising to get the school library and the brand new bug school. So we who come from a point of, again, white privilege, just think we know exactly what everybody needs.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think we'll see what happens with the DFL with those senators leaving the party. I'm sure that's going to be interesting. And I don't know what that will do to like the messaging, but I think that it'll be, I don't know. People outside Minnesota think like see it be blue every year and say, oh, that's like a really Democratic stronghold, but it's really not. I think we need to do more work to, get our message and our values out there.
Well, and just a gossip, what is your network saying about Amy? Is she gonna get a cabinet position?
Yeah, I think so.
You think?
Yeah.
No.
Oh. And then will Peggy Flanagan be the?
Oh my God, I love Peggy Flanagan so much. She's so great.
She is great. I just don't want Amy to leave the Senate because one of my little things is the fact that we've got to get our legislatures back in power. This executive is just driving me crazy. And I think Amy is one of the few leaders that I see who really can work across the aisle and yet keep kind of somewhat true. I'd like her to be a little more liberal, but I just think we have to get that Senate out of Mitch McConnell's hands and get real, true legislation working again. It's just not functional. And although she'd make a wonderful cabinet member, I'm sure, we've got to build those coalitions in the Senate. Don't get me started. You did get me started, but don't get me started. Okay.
When she has her stroke tonight, we'll just attribute it to you too.
It's your fault.
Thank you to both Gretchen and Janet for joining us today and having this dialogue with Adrian and I that maybe pose more questions than answers, as all good conversations do. For me, at least, it was very interesting to learn about what has changed over time and stayed the same in terms of issues and how advocacy and organizing works. And we hope that everyone in our audience has at least taken something away from this conversation and the advice that we all shared today. With that, we invite everyone listening to reach out to us on social media, and we have a couple of really exciting interviews coming up in the near future. So be sure to subscribe and follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Lastly, we're happy that you could all join us today, and we hope to see you again soon in our municipality.